Imagine walking down the dusty streets of a West African town and seeing mothers with wheelbarrows, young students wielding brooms, and elders carefully raking the gutters, not out of obligation but out of pride. No politicians barking orders, no international aid trucks in sight, just 30,000 ordinary citizens rising up in the most unexpected of ways, not with protests or weapons, but with cleaning tools and unshakable conviction. In September 2023, something astonishing happened in the often overlooked nation of Burkina Faso. Without a single dollar of foreign aid or a government decree, a movement erupted across the country. Teachers left the classrooms, traders closed shops, soldiers laid down their rifles. Together they all picked up brooms and shovels to clean. Streets, hospitals, schools, markets, drainage canals, all transformed in just 7 days. This wasn't a government program, it wasn't a charity initiative. It was a revolution, a sanitation revolution. And at the heart of it stood a young leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, not giving commands from behind a desk, but shoulder to shoulder with farmers and students, cleaning his country with his own hands. For those of us watching from across the ocean, it's easy to overlook places like Burkina Faso. But stories like this, stories of grassroots courage, of dignity, reclaimed through simple acts, deserve to be told, because they challenge the narrative that poor nations must wait for help. They prove that change can start from within, and sometimes all it takes is a broom and a belief in something better. And perhaps after hearing this story, you might find yourself wondering if the people of one of Africa's poorest nations can come together to change their world with nothing but determination and a broom in hand. What might be possible in our own neighborhoods, our own communities? Sometimes the quietest revolutions speak the loudest. And sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that never make the headlines. If this resonates with you, if it stirs something deep in your heart, stay with us. There's more to uncover. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, shared, and remembered well, then you're exactly where you need to be. It all began with a voice, not from a foreign diplomat or a polished television anchor, but from a young soldier turned president who believed in the soul of his people. In a radio address broadcast across Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't call for protests or policies. He called for brooms. This land is ours. No one will clean it for us. Let us rise together. Those words, simple as they may seem, rippled across the country like thunder over the Sahel plains. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa, had long suffered under the weight of inadequate infrastructure, especially in sanitation. Overflowing garbage in markets, dust-choked roads. Hospitals are burdened not just by lack of supplies, but by unsanitary conditions that endanger both patients and staff. For years, promises had been made. Aid had come and gone, but little ever changed. Until September 2023. Something different stirred that month. This time there was no funding campaign, no international NGO, no top-down government decree, just a call and a response. In villages where electricity flickers and water is carried in buckets, people listened. In crowded cities like Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, the chatter spread fast. Teachers paused their lessons. Farmers postponed their harvest. Market women set down their goods. Young people dropped their school books. And from every corner of the nation, they rose with nothing more than rakes, wheelbarrows, gloves, and an unyielding belief that they could reclaim their streets, their hospitals, their schools. For 7 days straight, the nation moved as one. Streets that had long been buried in dust and debris were swept clean. Piles of refuse, some sitting for years, were carted away by volunteers working shoulder to shoulder. The thump of shovels, the grind of wheelbarrows, and the rhythm of sweeping brooms became the soundtrack of a country rediscovering its dignity. There was no fanfare, no payments, no uniforms, just unity. And something else remarkable happened. This wasn't a job for someone else. It was everyone's job. Students cleaned their own classrooms. Shopkeepers scrubbed their storefronts. Women, often burdened with the heaviest roles in daily life, organized their neighborhoods into rotating crews, leading with precision, strength, and grace. Soldiers, often seen only in times of conflict, stepped out of their barracks not to enforce but to help. Side by side, they worked with the same people they swore to protect. Medical centers long plagued by sanitation-related illnesses like diarrhea and cholera were cleaned until they gleamed. Nurses reported fewer infections. In rural clinics, doctors described the change as life-saving. One midwife told reporters that for the first time in her 20-year career, she felt proud walking into her delivery room. "The air is clean now," she said, tears in her eyes. But this was more than just a cleanup. It was a kind of healing, not just for the streets, but for the spirit of a people long forgotten by the world. Village elders watched in quiet awe. Some whispered that they hadn't seen such unity since independence. Children once taught to stay away from dirty places now laughed as they cleared paths and planted flowers. And leading by example, President Traoré didn't stay behind a desk. He showed up in boots and gloves, broom in hand, not for the cameras, but for the country. His presence was not symbolic, it was catalytic. When the people saw their president sweat beside them, something changed. Respect turned into devotion. A movement became a revolution. There were no titles in the streets that week. No rich or poor, no civilian or soldier, just Burkina Faso, one people, one mission, one voice. One community leader in the town of Kodougou put it simply: we didn't need a miracle. We needed each other. In a world so often divided by politics, inequality, and disillusionment, Burkina Faso offered a different image, one of hope, born not from privilege, but from shared struggle. It was not just trash that was being removed. It was despair. It was apathy. It was the idea that someone else must fix what is broken, and in its place, something stronger. The belief that when people act with one heart, even a broom can change a nation. By the fourth day of the cleanup, something remarkable had happened. Silence fell over the usual noise of complaint. Instead of lamenting the government or blaming the past, people were too busy sweeping, scrubbing, planting, and rebuilding. What began as a symbolic act quickly transformed into a full-blown movement, emotional, spiritual, and transformational. The air itself felt different. In Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso's bustling capital, main thoroughfares shimmered in the afternoon sun, no longer cloaked in dust or cluttered by trash. Street vendors who once worked among flies and rot now set up their stalls in tidy, sanitized markets. School children returned to gleaming classrooms. For many, it was the first time they'd seen their learning spaces so clean and welcoming. But beyond the clean walls and freshly swept streets, it was the faces that told the story. People smiled more. Elders stood at their doorways watching in quiet pride as young people, some of whom had never cared for public space before, swept with purpose. In the rural village of Kaya, one 12-year-old boy reportedly said to his teacher, "I thought only grown-ups could fix the country, but I think we can too." The hospitals became the crown jewel of the campaign's success. In Bobo Dioulasso, medical staff described the change as nothing short of miraculous. Entire wings that had once been deemed too dirty or hazardous were now operational. Patients rested in clean beds surrounded by freshly painted walls. Cholera cases dropped noticeably within a week. Doctors reported fewer complications from infections, fewer cases of diarrhea and malaria. Nurses described feeling a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just tending to the sick, they were now part of a national revival. And amid this transformation, one image captured the hearts of millions: President Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in a faded uniform, sweating alongside volunteers, pushing a wheelbarrow full of debris through a narrow alley. He wasn't giving speeches from a podium. He wasn't flanked by security or foreign advisors. He was down in the mud, leading not with orders, but with action. That moment was replayed across radios, TV stations, and mobile phones. It became a symbol, the leader not above the people, but among them. In a society where faith runs deep, the religious response was profound. Imams, pastors, and traditional spiritual leaders declared the cleanup effort not just a civic duty, but a moral obligation. Sermons across the nation spoke of cleanliness as sacred. In mosques, imams cited the Prophet's teachings on hygiene and stewardship. In churches, priests reminded congregants of caring for creation. Elders performed blessings over freshly cleaned wells, and community leaders led collective prayers in cleared-out squares. The spiritual framing of this movement gave it staying power. This was not just about sanitation, this was about the soul of the nation. As the week progressed, the outside world began to take notice. From Ghana and Mali to Niger, news of Burkina Faso's transformation spread. Delegations of journalists, development workers, and government observers crossed borders to witness the sanitation miracle. Some were skeptical, expecting a PR stunt, but what they found was deeply human and undeniably real. International health experts marveled at the low-cost, high-impact results. Without billions in foreign aid or heavy infrastructure investment, Burkina Faso had triggered measurable public health outcomes in just days. United Nations observers described it as a replicable model for other developing nations struggling with sanitation, civic engagement, and social cohesion. One senior advisor from a West African development agency after visiting 2 provincial towns said, "We've spent millions trying to educate people about community responsibility. They did it in a week with wheelbarrows." Development economists from Europe were equally stunned. Some described the initiative as textbook effective. It cost virtually nothing, relied entirely on local materials and labor, and produced benefits far beyond what any spreadsheet could predict: pride, ownership, dignity. The praise wasn't limited to African voices. Editorials in France and Belgium, former colonial powers, cautiously applauded the bottom-up model led by President Traoré. Western NGOs, often criticized for bureaucratic inefficiency, quietly re-evaluated their own strategies. The unspoken question lingered in meeting rooms across the continent. If Burkina Faso can do this, what's our excuse? But for the people of Burkina Faso, the greatest reward wasn't international recognition. It was the joy of rediscovery of their public spaces, of their ability to lead themselves, of what unity, even in the most modest of forms, can achieve. By the 7th and final day, the sweeping didn't stop. In fact, it spread. Town after town declared they would continue the work monthly. People began organizing their own community cleanup committees. Songs were composed, poems, written, murals, painted, all celebrating what they had achieved together. As one elderly woman in the town of Gawa said, "I've seen many things in my life, but this is the first time I've seen my people so proud to be who they are." What began with a broom soon grew into something far greater, a shift in identity. For decades, the people of Burkina Faso had been told who they were: a poor country reliant on aid, stuck in instability. But after that fateful week, the narrative changed, not from the top down, but from the sidewalks up. The first and most visible transformation was psychological. A quiet confidence began to settle over the country. The cleanup effort had revealed not just cleaner streets, but a new sense of civic ownership. People who once felt powerless in the face of broken infrastructure or slow bureaucracy realized they didn't need to wait for someone else to fix things. They could do it themselves together. That shift in mindset carried real consequences. Across towns and provinces, neighborhood committees were spontaneously formed, not mandated by the state, but by residents themselves. These groups began coordinating monthly cleanups, repairing broken benches, repainting public buildings, and protecting cleaned areas from litter. Markets that once had no regulation began posting volunteer-run sanitation posts. School principals organized Pride Days, where students would not only clean their schoolyards, but also present short plays about community values and unity. This kind of bottom-up civic engagement is rare in many parts of the world, especially in places where public trust in government has been historically low. And yet in Burkina Faso, something had been unlocked, a culture of participation rooted in dignity rather than obligation. From there, the political ripple effects began to emerge. Municipal governments, many of which had long been plagued by inefficiency and detachment, suddenly found themselves having to respond to citizens more directly. In some cases, local mayors were publicly praised or criticized based on how well they supported the community's momentum. One mayor in the northern town of Ouagadougou reportedly redirected budget funds to supply more tools for neighborhood cleanups after residents staged a peaceful demonstration not demanding money, but simply asking for more rakes and gloves. This was not a protest in the traditional sense. It was a new kind of accountability, one based not in anger, but in action. Even the national government took notice. Seeing the sustained enthusiasm, President Ibrahim Traoré made a landmark announcement: Burkina Faso would adopt a monthly national cleanup day every last Saturday. Citizens across the country would gather again to preserve what they had begun. It would not be enforced by law, there would be no penalties for absence, participation would remain voluntary, but it would be nationally recognized with resources allocated, school participation encouraged, and public spaces reserved. The symbolism was powerful. Rather than pass fleeting reforms or create expensive programs, the government institutionalized a movement born from the people. This wasn't about top-down control. It was about state and society walking in step. The effect on youth was particularly striking. For a generation that had grown up hearing only of conflict, poverty, and migration, this movement became a civic awakening. Young people started forming local action clubs. In the southern region of Benfora, a group of students created a peer-to-peer hygiene program teaching younger children about environmental responsibility. Some teenagers even wrote letters to national media outlets urging their elders not to let this spirit fade. One letter written by a 16-year-old girl named Mariam was read aloud on national radio. In it, she said, "We used to hear that our country was broken, but I think it was only sleeping. Now it is waking up, and I want to be part of its future." Women, too, emerged as leaders in unexpected ways. Long seen as the unseen engine of Burkinabe households, women stepped into public leadership roles with quiet strength. They didn't wait for invitations. They organized neighborhood teams, coordinated logistics, and in some places were elected to lead local community boards created out of the cleanup effort. In marketplaces, women composed songs to celebrate unity and responsibility. These songs, sung while cleaning, cooking, and gathering, became part of a new oral tradition that preserved the spirit of the movement in everyday life. This spontaneous rise in female civic leadership began reshaping gender dynamics in subtle but meaningful ways. While the movement wasn't born as a women's rights campaign, it ended up elevating women's voices and visibility in both community and political spaces. Religious and traditional leaders also adapted. Instead of sitting back, many stepped forward to institutionalize the spirit of the revolution within their congregations. Imams and pastors began scheduling cleanups before major festivals. Ceremonial chiefs allocated ancestral lands for planting trees and establishing permanent community gardens. In some regions, tribal elders added a new rite of passage for boys entering adulthood, participating in a full day of public service with their fathers. The cultural symbolism of this shift cannot be overstated. In a nation where tradition and community are deeply intertwined, these acts sent a message to be Burkinabe is not just a matter of blood. It is a matter of service. Ultimately, the sanitation revolution became more than a week of action. It became a redefinition of citizenship. Not with grand speeches or foreign consultants, but with brooms, unity, and heart, the people of Burkina Faso had built something rare, a shared national identity, forged not in war or elections, but in collective care. As images of Burkina Faso's cleanup revolution began circulating across global media, the response was swift and in many quarters stunned. In neighboring African nations such as Ghana, Mali, and Niger, delegations quietly crossed borders to witness the transformation firsthand. What they saw defied convention, not a military operation, not a donor-funded initiative, but tens of thousands of ordinary people reshaping their country with tools no more complex than a broom and a wheelbarrow. African leaders and civil society groups began to murmur what development agencies had long avoided. If Burkina Faso can do it with no money, no consultants, no outside pressure, why can't we, European media, though more cautious, acknowledge the breakthrough? In France, editorials questioned decades of aid dependency models. One headline read, "When the people lead Burkina Faso's lesson in self-reliance." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., think tanks and global development analysts took note. Reports filtered through USAID and the United Nations citing the movement as a scalable civic engagement framework with high returns and low entry costs. Policy papers were drafted, webinars were hosted. But behind the diplomatic language lay a deeper question, one far closer to home. What does this say about us? In American cities struggling with homelessness, urban decay, and civic disengagement, some community organizers began referencing Burkina Faso's example in local forums. "We wait for budget approvals and task forces," one pastor in Detroit said. They picked up brooms. To older Americans watching from afar, especially those who remember the grassroots movements of the 1960s and 70s, there's something profoundly familiar here, and perhaps uncomfortable. A reminder that real change doesn't always come from institutions, but from people who decide they've had enough. No formal degree required, no permits, just the will to act. And perhaps the question lingers in the minds of many viewers, if they can come together in a time of poverty and uncertainty, what's stopping us in a time of abundance? Burkina Faso's sanitation revolution may have lasted only 7 days, but its echoes will be felt for years to come. In a time when so many nations turn inward, divided by class politics and fear, this small West African country offered something radically different, a people not waiting to be saved, but standing up to save themselves. And yet movements like this are fragile. History teaches us that collective momentum can be fleeting. If not nurtured, if not protected, the spark can fade. The sweeping may stop, the pride may dim. Corruption, fatigue, or complacency may creep back in. That's the danger. That's the test ahead for Burkina Faso and for the rest of us. Because this story, in the end, is not just about them. It's about all of us, those who believe that dignity isn't given, it's reclaimed. That a nation isn't measured by its GDP, but by how its people respond when no help is coming. It's a reminder that the most powerful revolutions are not made with bullets or ballots, but with hands, sweat, and heart. So we ask you now, not with urgency, but with quiet seriousness. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's approach is a turning point for African reform, or simply a moment of passion that may fade? Can the people of Burkina Faso sustain this movement? Or will they need deeper structural change to carry it forward, and perhaps more personally, if they can change the future of their country with rakes and resolve? What small step can we take right here, right now to restore dignity in our own communities? If this story moved you, please consider sharing it. Share it with someone who still believes in people-powered change. Comment below, do you think this model could work where you live? And subscribe if you believe stories like these deserve more attention than the latest headline scandal. Because sometimes the most heroic tales don't come from the powerful, but from the overlooked. And sometimes the quiet act of picking up a broom is the first step in lifting up a nation.